Welcome to the Manchester Community Library. We are so glad to have you all. Thank you for coming. My name is Deborah Ehler Hansen. I am the librarian here at the Manchester Community Library, and I am also a part-time lecturer and the program coordinator for the School Library Media Studies sequence at UVM. So along with me, I have Dr. Lori Quinn and Peggy Price of the Stern Center for Language and Learning. And I will introduce them more in detail a little bit later. And I would like to extend a special thanks to GNAT for being here. They are our local TV station, and we are grateful to have them here today. They will be live streaming. It is being live streamed right now. And it will be recorded, and the recording will be put on their website so that anyone can watch it at a later date. So thank you so much for all of you, for all your help, Gina, everyone being here, and we'll get started. Okay. So this event is being offered as part of the Libraries Transforming Communities, Accessible Small and Rural Communities, an initiative of the American Library Association in collaboration with the Association for Rural and Small Libraries. Today we are having a community conversation about accessibility, neurodivergent conditions, and what we can do to help all our children thrive in reading and literacy. So why is this important? Well, to me, it's very important. One of my children had dyslexia, and I understand the difficulties in learning to read when one has dyslexia. And so for me, it's a personal dedication I have to helping children learn to read. And also because I was a school librarian. I retired last year, and officially, and so I love literacy. I love children being able to read, to access knowledge, and learn. So, you know, we need to, as a community, we really need to focus on this because it is so important. It's such an important topic today, especially. Today we are going to have a community conversation about accessibility. Oh, I just said that, didn't I? Oh my gosh.
It's still true.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So now I am at so what I'd like to tell you about is that today in the United States, in Vermont, and across the nation, we are in a reading crisis. 66% of Vermont fourth graders scored below proficient in reading in 2022, according to the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is the NAEP. 81% of Vermont fourth graders who qualify for free and reduced lunch scored below proficient in reading, according to the National Assessment of Education Progress, the NAEP. Did you know that according to the Agency of Education 2022, a free and reduced eligibility the free and reduced eligibility, reduced eligibility report, 45.5% of Manchester elementary middle school students qualified for free or reduced meals. That means that almost 50% of our children who live in Manchester live in poverty. And this is something I think that a lot of people don't know, and it's really important to understand that. When you look around Manchester, everything looks beautiful and lovely, but for almost 50% of our kids within our schools, it is not perhaps so lovely. The report maintains that to qualify as an income eligible for free meals based on an application, a household's income must be at or below 130% of the federal poverty guidelines. And that is according to the Agency of Education 2022. 95% of children can be taught to read by the end of first grade, according to researchers. And that is from D.A. Kilpatrick, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties. And did you know that 130 million adults in the U.S. have low literacy skills? 54% of American adults read below the equivalent of a 6th grade level, according to the Gallup analysis of data from the U.S. Department of Education. So what is accessibility? According to Oxford Languages, the definition of accessibility is the quality of being easy to obtain or use. Which leads me to the American Libraries Association Libraries Transforming Communities Focus on Small and Rural Libraries grant I wrote this year. We had the opportunity to receive $10,000 or $20,000 to improve accessibility within our library. We were very fortunate and grateful to have received the full $20,000. Our physical building is accessible to all. Unfortunately, our collections are not accessible to all. The stacks are too high, which prohibits browsing for both our children and those who are wheelchair bound. We are proud to be the true hub of the community and want all who come through our doors to feel welcome and respected. Our team is committed to ensuring that our collections become accessible to all. Unfortunately, our collections are not accessible to all. We are focusing on the physical accessibility to our children's collection for our primary audience, the children of our community, for this grant. We must treat all children with dignity and respect. We must support the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility standards, as well as understand the effect of neurodivergent learning disabilities such as dyslexia and autism. We must apply what we learn to ensure that all children can access library collections without barriers. According to the United States government ADA accessibility standards, the maximum high forward or side reach while sitting in a wheelchair is 36 inches for ages 3 to 4, 40 inches for ages 5 to 8, and 44 inches for ages 9 to 12. Our children's collection is accessible for a person 6 feet in height at the higher levels. And if you look on each of these tables here, I have a picture that demonstrates, we have one of our associates, he's 6'2", and he has to reach to get a book in the children's library on the top shelf. We have a picture of a young child, 5 or 6, yeah, and he can barely reach up at all. So it's really important. That's why we're focusing on this physical accessibility, as well as the neurodivergent conditions. So lack of physical accessibility particularly affects children who are wheel-bound and those who are neurodivergent, which includes medical conditions such as dyslexia that are directly related to reading and the physical accessibility of books. The International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions recommends that public libraries support children with dyslexia by, number 1, using clear signs and pictograms, 2, creating an inspiring, easy-to-read area where users are invited to sit down and relax while browsing the collection. Number 3, choosing furniture that will encourage browsing and reading. Did you know that according to the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity 2023, neurodivergent disorders such as dyslexia affects 20% of the population and represents 80 to 90% of all those with learning disabilities? And the Cleveland Clinic asserts dyslexia is often found when children begin learning to read. So we need to start early, and we need to have a plan on what to do to help our children. I do also have a picture of the shelving that we'll be purchasing on each of the tables. This is the school library that I worked in. I had that shelving. I purchased it for that library, and it's wonderful. It's not very high, and you can get it in a couple different heights, and it's mobile, and you can, because it's mobile, you can create areas for the children to sit down, pull the books off the shelf, get them in their hands, and browse through the books so they can pick the right book, for them that they are interested in and that they want to read. All right. So, thus, the $20,000 grant will fund new shelving in the children's room that will encourage browsing and reading. So today, we are super excited about collaborating and learning with the Stern Center for Language and Learning to create awareness specifically about neurodivergent learning disorders, dyslexia, and autism. We will also discuss the current reading crisis with each other. So this is a community conversation. Okay, we're going to engage with each other and create an action plan on how we as individuals and collectively can make a positive impact to help our children thrive in reading and literacy. Okay, so welcome. So we have Dr. Lori Quinn. She has served for decades in nonprofit educational leadership roles supporting innovative teaching and programs, and is proud of the impactful work of her team at the Stern Center. She is a champion of the Stern Center's mission of helping every learner to succeed. Dr. Quinn earned her PhD in English Literature from the University of New Hampshire and her master's and undergraduate degrees from Boston College. She currently serves on the Generator Board of Directors. Lori's perspective on inclusion is shaped by her experience parenting her son, a young man with autism, and by her belief that learning is a fundamental right for all. Joining Dr. Quinn is Peggy Price, Master of Education, who is a fellow of the prestigious Orton Gillingham Academy. Peggy is a literacy and special education expert who leads the Stern Center's teacher training in the Orton Gillingham approach to teaching reading. She provides training at the Orton Gillingham classroom, educator, associate, and certified levels. Price oversees a talented team of Orton Gillingham fellows who assist her with district-wide consulting and providing in-depth mentorship to educators seeking Orton Gillingham certification. She regularly speaks at national conferences about evidence-based literacy instruction, dyslexia, and neuromyths. Price is the co-author of Orton Gillingham for the K-2 Classroom, Weekly Guide, and Universal Assessment. Second edition. She has taught Orton Gillingham to students from ages 5 through 44 and loves witnessing her students, and now the educators she mentors, blossom as they learn the structure of the English language. Price holds a master's degree in special education, early childhood, multiple, and severe disabilities from Georgia State University. Her bachelor's degree is in psychology with a concentration in applied behavior analysis from Binghamton University. Binghamton, sorry, I mispronounced that. Okay, so we're going to observe, we have a few ground rules we'd like everyone to observe, please. We would like everyone to please talk respectfully, be respectful. Listen carefully to one another, let people finish speaking before others start to speak, and please don't be judgmental, okay? So, what I'm going to do, this is going to look like this. I'm going to ask a question of Peggy and Lori, and they will answer that, and then we're going to have a turn and talk. So, and I'll present a question for the turn and talk. We're going to talk with each other about the issue, and then we are going to come up and answer that question. People would come up, please, and write their comments, ideas, questions on the little post-its, and then place them under the question. And then end, after the questioning and the turn and talks, we will have a reflection period upon the whole conversation that we engaged in. Does anybody have any questions before we start? Okay. All right. So the first question I have is for Peggy. What is dyslexia and how does it affect reading development?
Thank you. First, I just want to make sure, can you all hear me okay in the back of the mic? Wonderful. First, I just want to thank Deb and Manchester Community Library and for all of you turning out on a Saturday in the summer in Vermont to be here and have this really important conversation. So I get this question a lot. What is dyslexia? And simply put, it's when an individual struggles with reading accurately, reading very effortlessly, so that might be accurate, but they read quite slowly, and also struggle with spelling and writing. And when you struggle with reading accurately or reading slowly, it makes reading not fun, and we avoid things that aren't enjoyable or fun, and then that really impairs our reading comprehension and our ability to learn about the world and really access the world, because in our modern society, literacy in many ways is the way we access the world. It's the way we access healthcare. It's the way we access our democracy. It's the way we access employment and navigating through the world. Like you shared, Deb, dyslexia is incredibly common. Like you shared, I have a master's degree in special education, and I didn't even learn when I was getting this degree how common dyslexia was. In many ways, I felt a little ill-prepared when I became a teacher. Of not only is it incredibly common, the statistics vary from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5, but that as a special educator, this is primarily many of the students I would work with. So the thing that I really hope everybody leaves today learning about dyslexia is that dyslexia is not a factor of someone's intelligence. Learning to read and spell is not a factor of one's intelligence. So in a way, that is what can be so frustrating for an individual with dyslexia, is they really are bright and inquisitive and intelligent, and they're struggling to learn something that's so necessary to do well in school for their own self-identity and to make their way in life.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know if there's any questions or...
Thank you. Well, now what I'd like everyone to do, unless you have a question specifically, I would like you to turn and talk with your neighbors about how do these factors that Peggy just mentioned affect us as individuals, community members, our state, and nationwide. Remember, she talked about, that there's a large percentage of our population that is affected by dyslexia. It's not,
Could I add a little
yes,
to the
yes.
turn and talk? Something that since I teach, I don't teach children anymore, but I teach educators. It might be interesting if you introduce yourself to someone else here, and if you feel comfortable to share, if you remember anything about your experience, perhaps learning how to read. I hear from a lot of individuals that, it came very easily, or no, it really didn't, and they remember being in maybe the low spelling group in school and how that felt, or maybe a family member or friend growing up with. So I wonder if there's a personal connection that you can reflect on your own experience in school.
Okay, so the next question we have, why do so many people struggle to learn how to read and write? I think Lori and Peggy will both talk about this from their own perspectives.
Sure, I'm happy to get us started.
Thank you.
How's this sound in the back? Okay? Hearing me all right? Great. Thank you, Deb. Let me echo Peggy's thanks for having us and for the important conversation that you're engaging in with your community around all of the complexities of inclusion, physical difference, neurodivergence. There are many ways to understand the issue of inclusion and equity, and our work at the Stern Center, I like to say that it's really important that we have learning right in the name of our organization, because while I have the great fortune to lead a team of folks who have tremendous expertise in a number of different areas related to literacy and language-based learning and autism, we are also an organization that is learning every day. All of us are learning, figuring it out, and importantly, I just want to sort of underscore making mistakes, which is, after all, how we learn as humans, even though it makes us a little squirmy sometimes and a little uncomfortable. And so in our work with students and families and teachers, part of the work begins with opening up the space for questions and stumbling and trying something that then needs revising. And so I just wanted to start by sharing that that's our experience as a nonprofit organization. That's how we try to wake up every morning with that openness to learning. And it's wonderful to be here with a community that's in the process of its own learning and questioning around the topics that are dear to our hearts. So Deb asked us about the difficulties in learning to read and to write in our present day reality. And I think it's kind of a vast question, actually. And so I'll give you a couple of key things and then turn over to Peggy for her far more expert perspective on the specifics of the reading brain. For me, I was one of those folks for whom the reading process and then very quickly thereafter the writing process happened kind of easily. It seemed sort of magical. And I've been a reader for as long as I can remember, and professionally, my identity is very bound up with being a reader and a writer. It's core to who I am. I can't imagine my life without that identity. And so I recognize now more than I ever did when I was learning to read easily and loving language and staying in school forever, as my family likes to say, thinking about books. I understand now better than I ever did the immense privilege that just happened to be how my brain's wired around reading and language. And believe me, it is kind of the luck of the draw. That's the extraordinary truth about how our brains are or are not helping us out when it comes to reading and writing. And so that incredible effort that many of our students at the Stern Center are engaged in, the really noble quest to learn to read fluently, is something I care passionately about because I was on the fortunate side of that roulette wheel, and I know what it's meant to my own journey and my own life to have that immense privilege of reading and reading easily and having the ability to express with language what's inside of me. And so my job includes helping others to do that, right? And that's a great reason to be part of the Stern Center. One of the things that we're invested in helping our whole community in Vermont and beyond understand is that we have a reading crisis unfolding right under our noses. And those of us for whom reading was a relatively easy process, those of us for whom our libraries feel like a second home, really have an obligation, I believe, to understand this reading crisis, to know how we got here, and to sort of open our eyes to what's really in plain sight in front of us in those statistics from the national tests around reading, in our own communities when we see the downstream consequences of low literacy, the impact that has on employment prospects, the realities of how that shapes the school-to-prison pipeline. And the truth about reading, as a recent documentary title has it, is that we failed an awful lot of kids when it comes to literacy. And so we're invested at the Stern Center in helping folks understand not the blame game, just to be absolutely clear. I am an educator. I love teachers. They are my people, and I am not interested in blaming teachers. And I completely reject the idea that this is anyone's fault. And yet, here we are with a whole bunch of kids and a whole bunch of adults who can't read their medication, who don't know how to help their kids learn to read, right? And so this crisis has really far-reaching implications. One of the unfortunate contributors to the crisis has been the methods of teaching reading in our schools that have prevailed over the last few decades in particular. And like many things that have unintended consequences, those methods come from a really good place. They come from a place of belief in the power of play and pleasure when it comes to reading, and the fear that a more phonics-oriented, sounds and symbols-oriented approach to the English language might take the joy out of reading. That if we could just set up enough cozy corners where inviting chairs and beautiful books beckon to the reader who's learning, that somehow reading will just happen. The unfortunate truth of cognitive science is it doesn't work that way. And so we've set up systems to teach our kids to read that are missing. A huge chunk of those kids worked great for me, but guess what? The kids on either side of me were struggling. They needed a much more explicit version of how those letter sounds turn into words and how those words turn into sentences and how the magic of reading comprehension creates new neural pathways for us as we become readers. And so that is sort of a hiding in plain sight contributor. Some of you in the room are educators and are aware of this huge shift that many schools are experiencing. I applaud you if you've been on this journey with your fellow teachers who are learning about the shift away from balanced literacy, which is the sort of umbrella term for the curriculum I described, and toward structured literacy or the science of reading, which is what we do at the Stern Center. And it really is about uniting the knowledge that research has given us across the fields, across the disciplines, with the way we're teaching. It's connecting the big dots between how does the brain learn to read and how do we teach kids to read. So that is an important contributor. I would love for you to hear from Peggy about some other reasons that reading isn't seamless for so many folks. So Peggy.
Well, I love that explanation. So one thing I like to do when I teach, sorry, you're going to get the teacher in me. My husband says I do this to him too, and I'm like, great job. I'm going to have you all, I'm going to give you a statement, and you're going to have to vote true, thumbs up, or false, thumbs down. And I always think it's better if we don't all agree, because then we can discuss a bit more. Okay, so here's the statement. You ready? You know your hand signal? Okay. This is the statement. The human brain is wired to learn how to read. What do y'all think? Yes or no? And hold them high. Hold them high. Okay.
Oh, this group's too smart.
All right. Yeah, so I'm seeing mostly thumbs down, or maybe some people like, I'm not quite sure. That's good. That's why you're here. That's why we're here to learn. So the reality is we all have a Homo sapien brain. And Homo sapiens have been around for tens of thousands, many thousands and thousands of years. But it's only been in about the last 5,000 years that humans invented writing, and it's only been recently, in the last 100 years, the idea of mass literacy being really necessary, I would say, for survival, to be able to feed yourself, clothe yourself. So while the human brain is wired for language acquisition, if we think about babies, no one sends their babies to school to learn how to speak. That doesn't mean all individuals acquire that seamlessly. That's why we need the field of speech-language pathology, and that's a very important role, and some individuals absolutely struggle with language. But for the most part, the human brain is wired for language, but our human brain was never and will never be wired for reading and writing. And just understanding that simple fact really helps us all better look at how we should teach children how to read based on the science. Like you were saying, Lori, about having those cozy book corners, that's important. We want to immerse our children in great literature and picture books. No one is saying that's not important, but just like if we want individuals to learn how to ride a car, I wouldn't say to my 9-year-old, you've been sitting in the back seat watching me drive a car for the last 9 years. So you've watched me do it, get in the front seat, and here's the car key. We would never say that, right? We would teach explicitly, this is the brake pedal, or if it's stick shift, like I was tortured to learn, this is how you work the clutch. And you have to systematically teach skills till you really get that automatized. So now when I get in my car and I'm driving to work, I don't really have to spend much time thinking about where my feet go. I can spend all my mental, cognitive energy focused on, oh, what's happening on the road. So that's how we need to teach children in kindergarten, first and second grade. These early years are so crucial. If we really do our jobs right in school, teaching them how to crack the code, really mastering letter sounds, handwriting, spelling, and a skill that underlies all of this, which is a fancy term called phonemic awareness, that really just means our brain's ability to play with sounds and words. So for example, if I said, say cat, but don't say k, you all would answer? Very good. You all have some good phonemic awareness. And of course, it can be simpler or more complex than that. We have to teach skills like that too. And there's a real hierarchy of progression in skills. So going back to the initial question, why do so many individuals learn how to read? One, our brain was never wired for this. We're creating new pathways in our brain when you learn how to read. And two, the English language is really complex. It's not nonsensical. There are a lot of rules and systems, but it's not as simple or straightforward as other writing systems like, let's say, Spanish or Finnish, which, interesting, in those countries where there's really no debate how to teach reading. They just teach systematic phonics. But English, because we have a really complex writing system, it can feel like, well, there's so many words that seem to break, who knows what rules, we'll just teach our children to memorize rules. Or this idea that reading is a very visual act. When what we know from the science that comes from decades of neuroimaging, cognitive psychology, eye tracking, educational psychology, the scientific community is of complete consensus that the English language has this complexity, but as educators we can learn it. I initially did not learn it in school, but later I did, and that's part of our job at the Stern Center is we work with a lot of teachers very hungry for this information. Some have said, I've been waiting over a year to come and take this course. Now I know what to do when my student struggles how to read. So I also want to really impress upon this reading crisis is a solvable crisis. We have dedicated teachers in schools, certainly dedicated families, and we have the science. We know how to do this.
Thank you both. Thank you both very much. So now we're going to have our turn and talk in regard to this last discussion here. So what is currently being done to address these factors? So what do you find if you work in a school or as a parent? What is being done to address the factors that they just mentioned? Peggy and Lori.
I add a little something to that too.
Yes.
And you can take or leave this suggestion. I always find if we can somehow make it personal on our lives. So I just told you that learning how to read and write is not a natural skill. It's a procedural skill that our brain has to learn how to read. Like I had to learn how to drive a car, or maybe you learned how to ski or knit or play a musical instrument. So I wonder if you could also maybe think about a procedural skill you learned at some point in your life, or you're learning how to do that now, and what helped you learn it? I will tell you, my dad, when he was teaching me how to drive stick shift at 16, saying, this is how the clutch works. Scott said, okay, now we're going on the road. That did not help me. But when we got into a parking lot and we did a lot of start and stop, in first gear, that did help. So I wonder if And I think that little analogy, this is what we're talking about. This is going to help solve the reading crisis, is teaching reading that same way too.
Thank you.
And anyone else is free to use my stick shift driving analogy if that's pertains to your life.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Okay, so we do have one person who has a question, and that would be our director, library director, Ed Surgeon.
So I'm curious to know, in my breakout conversation here, what does the science tell us about the relationship between handwriting and development of reading skills, motor skills, and the repetition, the use of a multisensory approach? How does all that fit together in this mix?
Great question.
I'm sorry, I was just forgetting to turn my mic on. Well, first off, that was such a great... Do I need to repeat the question, or everyone heard it? Everyone heard it? Okay. So you're asking an excellent question. Handwriting is really an important multi-sensory vehicle for learning how to read and spell. We often, I remember when I was in school, I had a little report card that was where the teacher would fill it out and it was carbon copy, and you got a little grade for penmanship. And I think often we view handwriting or penmanship as its own skill, or it might be nice to have nice handwriting, but everything's replaced by technology. What's the point? Actually, the science has shown that's not true. There's been a lot of research that's been shown that when you're teaching a writing system, like letters and sounds, when you focus on how you form the letter, it helps the brain really deepen the connection between the letter and sounds. So if we think about teaching children, let's say in kindergarten, or a child with dyslexia how to read, or an adult with dyslexia how to read, we want them to know, for example, that B says B, or that M says M. We really want to cement that letter-sound correspondence. We want it to be that, as a skilled reader, you can't help but read the word. It's really hard to inhibit reading the word once you're a skilled reader. So an important way of cementing that letter-sound correspondence is teaching the letter formation. Now, initially, if we think about babies and toddlers, we're working on gross motor and fine motor skills, even like that pincer grip. But one thing that's important that all teachers are really well trained how to do in pre-K and in kindergarten is, how do we help develop these fine motor skills or graphomotor skills needed? Should I hold the pencil? How should I position the paper? Where should I start the letter? If I'm struggling to make this letter, how can my teacher help me? So there's really specific skills that teachers can utilize to help them. And one interesting study, it was published just a couple years ago, is out of Johns Hopkins. It was done with college students, and they were teaching them Arabic letters, and none of the students spoke Arabic. So this was a new writing system for them to learn. And they had 3 conditions. One where they just taught them the letter and sound symbol, one where they typed it, and the other where they hand wrote it. Which group did better at post-testing with reading words? Not on writing the letters, but with reading Arabic words. What do y'all think?
Writing.
The writing piece. That is just one example of many that handwriting piece is important. And Lori mentioned before how the science really supports something called structured literacy. That means teachers understand the complex structure of the English language. There's actually rules why words are spelled with DGE or GE. There's rules why sometimes you double a letter when you're adding a suffix. There's actual rules behind all of this. It's complicated. The teacher can learn it and then slowly, systematically teach it to the student. Just like math, there's rules around math. And something, I think, like the Pythagorean theorem, I blocked that out, but this is why I specialize in literacy, not math. But just like we wouldn't say, well, math is too complicated, let's not bother to teach it. we understand, well, we're going to start simple with just basic counting, then addition, subtraction. So we start simple with our students in kindergarten, basic letter sound correspondence, playing with sounds and words like you did, say cat without the handwriting, putting it together, and then it slowly becomes a lot more complicated where we'll be teaching Latin roots and Greek roots and how that helps unlock words in science and social studies and math. So don't let anyone tell you that this is too complicated for kids to learn or that handwriting is a waste of time, because it's a good use of our time. And I don't know if you have a follow-up question.
I do. So prior to spending the last year here in Manchester, I spent the prior dozen years in high school environments with teenagers. And many, if not most of them, arrive with what I would describe as primitive handwriting skills. The kind of thing that would have been, and I'm 61 years old, so I'm going to age myself here a bit, but when I was a kid, it's the kind of block kind of printing that would be characteristic of a 5 or 6 year old being presented by 13, 14, 15-year-olds. What can we do from where we are, knowing this link between handwriting and reading and literacy, to change what that looks like? Because again, by the time a child becomes an adolescent, the interventions become more and more difficult.
That's a great question. The simple answer is it's not too late. Don't give up on it. So I think there's two different pieces. One is being able to access the curriculum, and if, let's say it's a science lab report, let them use speech to text or type up their answer, because our goal here is we want to get their knowledge out. We don't want the handwriting to be a barrier, because I'm assuming that a lot of those high school students probably hate writing too. Because when the handwriting piece is laborious and then the spelling's difficult, often I see individuals, well, they'll maybe use the word good or bad in the writing, but they know the words exuberant and disappointed. But they won't even attempt to spell these words, and they just really avoid writing, and they write very little. So there's one piece where we want to give accommodations to get the output, be able to express it. But the other piece is, while we might package it differently for I know I used a couple examples of a kindergartner, all individuals would benefit from that type of instruction. That's a lot of what we do at the Stern Center in our instruction department and our professional learning. We're working with one school district now with all the middle school special educators. We're seeing a lot of exactly what you're talking about. And in a structured literacy or an Orton Gillingham lesson, you're integrating the handwriting while you're teaching these language skills and spelling skills. So it's not like handwriting is separated, it's integrated. And my last recommendation is cursive. So many individuals that have, I like your analogy of like this more primitive or very, I would say like more immature handwriting. Often students are self-conscious of that. When you teach them cursive, in some ways cursive is easier because all the lowercase letters start at the bottom. There's a lower chance of having a letter reversal. Not all individuals with dyslexia have letter reversals, but many do with B and D or P and Q, but in cursive it's different. And I have a lot of students where their handwriting and manuscript still continues to look very immature, but then when it's in cursive, you would never even know it's the same person that wrote it. And I often start, and when we're mentoring teachers, I'll say start with that signature. Because when that high schooler or that middle schooler can sign their name in cursive, that's also tremendously empowering to their self-esteem. So you start there. I kind of call like cursive signatures the gateway drug to more cursive handwriting and more. And so I would say start there. It's not too late.
I missed the first part of what he was asking before, but this is like my hot button for me because I can remember. Oh, thank you. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. I struggle to watch my own 3 kids. I didn't bring them over on here. We just recently moved up here, but how they have taken the handwriting out of the curriculum, and I can remember how much handwriting we did over and over in cursive, and I enjoyed it. I mean, for whatever reason. But then watching my own children struggle with handwriting and spelling and all these different things and literacy and reading, and asking the teachers and the schools, you know, what to do about this, and they would say, oh, just let them type, just put them on the computer. And that frustrated me, but I kind of let it go. But the more it aided me, I started to ask more questions and then realize they weren't teaching them how to type either. So it was like, okay, we're really just throwing them to the dogs. So now I have teenagers whose handwriting is awful, and then I watch them type, and trust me, they're on the computer all the time, and they're not doing pegging. So it's like, what are we doing? And my dream is to like go back to where we were just doing penmanship all the time, handwriting and cursive especially, and you know, the whole mind mapping thing, but I can see how, and I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but I can see how there's a huge disconnect between the handwriting and everything else. And then they think it's wonderful to just, yes, throw them on the computer. Yes, it's helpful, and I get that. But then teach them how to type.
Yeah.
One of the, sorry, Maggie, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, all your instincts were right and aligned with the research.
Yeah. This is not a research-based observation, it's more of a cultural observation. But I do think that, our young people are deeply shaped by the way that we have built their schools to be about expediency and time. Curricula, move on, right? We got to do this so we can get to that. The school day is structured this way so that we can fit in this, that, and the other thing. And when we're working with teachers on their own learning, one of the things we try to be mindful of is this balance between the practicality of the school day and the school year and the fact that learning is not on a schedule, especially inclusive learning, right? And so when Peggy says it's never too late to play with handwriting, I would just underline that word play. We as adults can model the joy of slowing down and writing a letter to someone. I have been saying for the last 5 years, every time I try to do that now, my handwriting is deteriorating. What is happening to me? Now, my own literacy is fully formed, but I can still model what it looks like to sit down and enjoy the process of forming letters. And you know, this is the beautiful secret of learning, right? Is that if we don't know that school is making us do it on a specific schedule, all of a sudden it's fun and interesting, right? Remember the renaissance of adult coloring books, right? For relaxation, to create something beautiful. I'm secretly hoping that there'll be something like that happens with handwriting. And we'll come back into young people who are writing each other epistolary love sonnets, right? We can hope. We can hope.
Thank you. Mine's also a commentary. I've been teaching since 1989. When I was teaching in New Hampshire in the early 90s, the Reinhardt penmanship teacher would come once a month. And for that half an hour, she would instruct and we would practice. And so I really appreciated that time because we understood what's important. We were like, we gotta get ready, guys, she's coming in. And we have an expert. But then in the schedule we have now, last year my students were given 20 minutes to eat lunch. That included time to get their meal, eat their meal, clean up their meal, all in 20 minutes. And they had a special recess before lunch, and then they would go to a class like art was for gym. So they really were forced. So the daily schedule has really been very stressful, and I wish that the daily schedule would change, but it's not in the teacher's hands.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point, and you're not the only teacher here that's mentioned that if we don't have a schedule that supports appropriate intervention or enough time of instruction. You know, I want to give some good news, some slivers of hope is we offer a lot of courses through the Stern Center, most of whom are Vermont teachers, and they're all hearing that research on the importance of handwriting. And the school districts that we consult with, we talk a lot about the literacy block. And at the end of the day, I always say, what's your goal for your students by the end of 3rd grade, by the end of middle school, by the end of high school? If we want kids in 3rd grade to have a functional writing system, so they have a great story in their head, or they want to write a letter to the president or their local representative about something, we want them to have the skills to do that. We want them to be able to, out of simple, I'm going to call decodable text, and be able to pick a book from the library. Not that they can read everything, but they can read a lot in 3rd grade. If that's our goal, and because then you can learn a lot more once you can read and write, right? Then we need a schedule from day one that supports that. And it's okay if we're not giving kids computer time in kindergarten. That can come later, and we can teach them typing later. And I do find when we consult with schools, that is something we'll say, we will need to talk to you about your literacy block too, because otherwise if you're just sending teachers to a course, you're not going to get the same payoff you want, because then we get really bright teachers that are like, great, I know what to do, and now I don't have the schedule to support it. And that's why it's important that school administrators learn the science of reading too.
And we are seeing some courageous moves from school leaders to say, all right, maybe if we put these 2 20-minute blocks or 3 20-minute blocks together and dug in to literacy, we could move the needle for our students. And so I think that door is cracking open. And the more teachers understand it, the more, as Peggy said, school leaders understand the science, the more that parents insist that 20 minutes for a grown-up or a little one is an inhuman amount of time for a lunch break, right? So I think that the more we can speak with one voice about this kind of common sense, the more likely that these things that seem so intractable can in fact be reimagined.
Okay, thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything? Yes.
I am a paraprofessional. I have been for like 12 years.
Awesome.
And I've noticed over my years as an outside point of view, and I'm the mother of 4 children. I have a son, IEP, who's entering college this year. I noticed that in math and literacy, if there's like a 30-minute block, there may be 4 or 5 different levels of readers or math inside that classroom, and that teacher has to individually instruct every single one of those groups in that 40-minute block. So they actually only end up with less than 10 minutes of actual math instruction. And when you're not with the teacher, you're doing quote-unquote independent work, which, more so as a parent, it's almost disappointing that, you send your kid to school for 7.5 hours a day, and then you find out your kid actually gets reading instruction for 10 minutes, or math instruction for 15 minutes. So that is, from a parent point of view, it's sad, but from someone who works in the school. And we were talking about it in our group, is people are not working in schools. There's open jobs everywhere. We're low staffed. And so how do we even make that possible? Usually it's one person in the classroom with 20 kids trying to do this with a paraprofessional coming in and out of your classroom multiple times a day because they have to go to other classrooms. I don't know how to fix, that system I think is a problem.
We agree.
Yes, I see this, what you're talking about. You articulated it beautifully. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm at the lower end of the education. I'm an SLP with a birth to 3 population, so that's just, where I'm coming from. But what we were talking about, it can all be distilled down to, I think having something like this for communities, since we are mostly a community of educators here, but to get more people just community, because it all drizzles down to staffing and money. And unless the taxpayers say, you know what, we need to put our tax money so we can spend more money, and we also need a way to have people become educators. Because if we want to, like our group was talking about Gordon Gillingham and phonics and Linda Moon Bell, I mean, there are lots of different ways to teach a child how to read, but to have educators who can put your child is going to be best served by Gordon Gillingham, but Linda Moon Bell is to have an educator who knows all of the ways, and then to be able, I mean, that's money, staffing, time.
It's also will and commitment, right? And one of the things that I find pretty striking about our home state is that there is an inordinate amount of money, in some cases, not all, being poured into the places where it is having the least impact. And so really thinking as taxpayers about where is it worth investing? Well, based on everything we know about how people learn to read and the consequences of not learning to read, that pre-K, your field, kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, there's been a wonderful blossoming of conversation in Vermont about early education and the child care crisis. And one of the things that we at the Stern Center are very keen to do is to work with our partners in the early education and child care movement to say we can do an enormous amount together if we're also thinking about developing pre-literacy skills. If we are working with the littlest ones on the language-based learning games and helping their teachers have a sense of what does a typically developing reader look like? How do I know when something's a little off early on? Not waiting for third or fourth grade when kids hit the wall and their guessing strategies don't work anymore, right? But getting to them earlier. We just started at the Stern Center a new initiative called the Reading Readiness Checkup. And it's designed to help parents and early educators figure out exactly this question, right? What are those sort of 10 things I'm looking for? And so it's a little mini version of an evaluation. We're calling it a checkup because it isn't comprehensive, but it is an indicator of how are things developing. And so we want to continue our efforts to make sure that our work in literacy and language is reaching early enough in the developmental process that we're doing everything we can to support success at the kindergarten gate. I'll leave it at that for now.
So I know, Deb, we're really getting deep in the weeds here. You've got more you want to do, but I can't help but shift our gears here. Talked a lot now about what's going on in schools and education, but let's shift for a moment to what happens at home and with families. What I observe here in the library is we've got a number of families where their children are super readers. They're here all the time. Kids are reading a substantial quantity of a wide range of material. And so what can families do? What can parents do? What can guardians do that goes well beyond what happens or doesn't happen in the school environment? And I want you to particularly, if you could, address that in our age of these things, where everything is competition with technology. And many kids start from the time that they can barely hold anything in their hand, that they're watching things on screens.
And that is actually question number 3. What advice do you have for families with a child struggling to read and write?
Do you want me to?
Yes.
And I'll tie it back in there. So my first message is that you're not, to that family, you're not alone, and to that child, you're not alone. And not just for an individual with dyslexia, but any neurodivergent. It can feel very isolating. I say this So something happened in my personal life that my background's in special education, and I've spent 14 years working as a Gillingham practitioner, and less than 2 years ago, my oldest was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I went through everything that I saw families that I worked with for years going through too. Why is my child acting out in school? Why is he saying he's stupid all the time? And all that emotional turmoil. So that's the first thing I want families to know, is they're not alone and that there is help. It starts with getting appropriate testing from a qualified individual, because when you get that appropriate diagnosis, it's like, okay, now we know what it is and we can plan for it. So that's the first piece. And something my husband and we talk about a lot is, we've been in Vermont now 10 years, and I say this not as a Stern Center employee, that if the Stern Center didn't exist, we would have probably had to move out of state. Because that's where we were able, in the middle of the pandemic, that's where we were able to get an evaluation. Not because I was staff, but because the doors are open. This is where we could get the help we needed. And then get the appropriate instruction. That kind of goes back to like the taxpayer dollars, like Linda Bell, that's evidence-based, or in Gillingham, that's evidence-based. There's a lot of taxpayer dollars spent on programs that are not evidence-based, or every couple of years, there's a brand new initiative, and that burns teachers out. I've experienced that, where, oh, there's a whole new program to learn, instead of taking the time to make sure educators are taught the science, the scientific literacy, and to like, okay, so that's a different program, and I know how to make that work under my big, in-depth understanding of how children learn. And more advice for families is that I'm actually going to say, while we are our child's first teacher, we're also first and foremost their parent, their guardian, their grandparent, their aunt or uncle, and you don't have to be their teacher on them all the time. That just making language and learning about the world in books or podcasts, audiobooks, graphic novels. Something we've done for my child with dyslexia is we have books about Legos and books about Pokemon, and there's a lot of pictures in those books, and he loves flipping through those, and that's okay, because when he works with his Orton Gillingham tutor or with assigned reading, then we really sit down and we pay attention to sounding out each word and being accurate. But it can't, just like me learning how to drive stick shift in the parking lot, that can't be my whole life. It can't be, and that's something I'll just tell you personally, I've had to learn, is I can't be my own children's teacher in that way. I have to just be mom or be that parent or caregiver. But I can make language and learning come alive. And I think that's really important for libraries. If a library has any interesting programming, and that goes back to the screens too, because often an individual with dyslexia, they may love learning a podcast about climate change or tornadoes or sharks, but they can't necessarily access that print. So that audiobook or that podcast or books with beautiful photos or those graphic novels is an important vehicle for that. And so we shouldn't downgrade that too. And another thing that when Deb and I first met and we talked is, if I had a magic wand, I would love for all libraries to have a section on what's called decodable readers. So when an individual is a developing reader, they might be 5, they might be 50, let's say they only know short vowel sounds and the basic consonants. Well, then that's where they need to practice. Just like when you're learning math, we don't say, okay, well, this is exponents and this is long division. Okay, let's just start with counting and basic addition. So we want these simple decodable texts. They're not great literature. They're not going to win a Newbery Award, but for that beginning or developing or struggling reader, they can sound out like the red frog is on the mat. It's not quite interesting, but that's okay. It wasn't quite interesting when I was practicing stick shift in the parking lot, but I knew I needed that so I could go drive to my friend's house. And we need to say that's okay. So I think sometimes the unfortunate push of balanced literacy that was done with well-meaning, but is that I hear this from teachers a lot. We have to give them books right away. They have to be able to read. And these books are like the nice houses on a crevasse. Like, well, house has OU says ow. And nice, the C is going, there are rules for this. but they're in kindergarten. So are we telling them to just look at the picture and guess? Or do we just let them be kids, give them enough time for lunch, slowly teach them the letter sounds, put it all together? And I'll just share this one little story. Is I was working with a reading interventionist who was working with this 5th grader. A lot of the work we do is pretty intensive mentoring of teachers. So we watch teachers teach, and then we'll spend an hour walking them through that lesson and helping them plan their next lesson. Sometimes we ask them, send me your next lesson with your data, and I'll help you write even the one after that. So we're really, it's not like a 3-day workshop and you're done. We're really invested in training teachers, because teachers and families are part of the solution. So this 5th grader I saw, he was mixed up with his short vowels. He was confusing M and N. He was confusing B and D. He was confusing P and Q. Who's very bright. He also had dyslexia. So I told the teacher, I said, he's being very frustrated in these lessons. So I know that it feels like your lesson's so basic. You need to remove the D and just focus on B. You need to remove the N and just focus on M. So when I sit and tell him that at the start of the next lesson, these are letters you're confusing, I'm going to remove some of these for now till we get them solid. Do you know what this 5th grader said? Oh, phew, thank God, I was waiting for you to do something like this. He was in 5th grade. It didn't feel babyish to him. It felt like, finally, you're giving me something I can be successful at. So we shouldn't underestimate our children and any reader of any stage, that sometimes we have to take that step back to really cement skills in order to get them to their long-term goals of being able to access society through print.
Thank you. Thank you, Peggy. I think because of the time, we'll address question number 4, because it's also
Sure.
What advice do you have for families with a child with autism? And then we'll do our last turn and talk for the day. Okay.
Sounds great. So at the Stern Center, we work with folks on the spectrum and their families in a couple of different ways. Sometimes that looks like speech therapy for clients for whom that is a need. Very often it looks like a focus on social communication and social understanding, which, as those of you who have a person with autism in your life, how many folks are living with, near, interacting with a person with autism? As you know, and as others of you may be aware, the barriers to successful social communication for a neurodivergent learner are significant, and they are sometimes, to those of us who see the world in neurotypical ways, they are sometimes surprising. They are often funny, often heartbreaking. And one of the things I love about being part of the Stern Center's work is that we have the opportunity to help create some community. And so my advice starts with that. It starts with an echo of what Peggy said about parenting a dyslexic child, which is you are not by yourself in this. There is a community of families and friends and loved ones who understand what it means to go through the world with this person with autism at your side, in your care. The other thing that I think is critically important is a truism, a saying in the autism community, which is, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. That the spectrum is vast, and the way that autism looks is variable as our humanity, truly. And so thinking about, is this person with autism a highly verbal person who might love repetitive stories? Is this person with autism a nonverbal person who might have some of the same kinds of expression challenges that Peggy was alluding to earlier with not having access to writing? And so the places where our children with autism can thrive are environments where those of us who do not navigate the world with neurodivergence have learned to see it differently. There is a tremendous emphasis in our social communication program and in all kinds of support for autism on perspective taking. And perspective taking for folks with autism is very hard. When you tend to see the world literally, it is very difficult to do that thing of imagining yourself through someone else's experience. But I have learned in my experience as a parent and as an educator that actually what happens with perspective taking is we think that we are teaching the person with autism about perspective taking. But in the process, the person with autism teaches us about perspective taking. Because being an effective advocate and ally for a person with autism requires that we do just that. That we stop and we look at our environment and we say, these lights, these sounds, this carpet pattern, this person next to me who might have on beautiful perfume, these sensory inputs that for a neurodivergent brain may be profoundly distracting in ways that we don't even notice as neurotypical folks. The ability to navigate our environments with, this is a beautiful room, right? There's art, there's lovely light, there's natural light and thoughtfully chosen decorative light. These chairs may or may not be comfortable for us, right? I have learned to notice my environment in ways that have required a new kind of perspective taking. Because I love and am responsible for a person with autism. And so I want to tell you a quick story that I think illustrates this. When my son, who's now an 18-year-old guy, was a little guy, we had a pediatrician appointment one afternoon. My husband, Peter, took our son to the appointment. We had a wonderful pediatrician. He was a great guy. Our kid had a full-on meltdown on the sidewalk walking into the pediatrician's office. Mama wasn't there, as my husband would be quick to tell you. And it was Dad's job to figure out why on earth is this little boy, who loves his pediatrician, losing it at the thought of walking through these doors. They've got the cool fish tank, they've got the nice people. What's going on? Is this just today? Or is this a new stage of development? This puzzle, right? That we as parents didn't have the decoder ring. We didn't know what was triggering this. And so, because our pediatrician was fabulous, he came outside and did a quick well-child checkup on the sidewalk, right? So, there's an asterisk on this story that says, everybody in medical school needs to know that that's what you do. But meanwhile, this kid's growing up. We get through the pediatrician visits eventually. He says to me when he's about 11 or 12, so 6 years have gone by. It doesn't occur to him that he should have told me this as soon as he had the language to tell me, right? He said to me, Mom, do you remember when I used to go to my doctor and there was a nurse there who had glasses? I said, yeah. He said, her name was Michelle. Do you remember Michelle? I said, I do. He said, do you know the day when Dad and I were going to an appointment and Michelle was going to be my nurse? And he said, and I had a tough one. Tough one means sidewalk meltdown. And I said, I do remember that story. I remember you and Dad telling me when you got home that it was a tough one. He said, yeah, her glasses were so shiny. And I said, her glasses? And he said, yeah, you know, she had the kind without the frames on the bottom. And there I was in my profound need for perspective taking. I thought about, what would it mean to be about this tall, looking up at a perfectly nice woman who was about to give me medical care, and being absolutely overwhelmed by the visual input of shiny glass lenses, right? And the fear of having that sensory experience completely derail him led to the sidewalk meltdown. Now, it only took me 7 years of waiting as a mom to get that decoder ring. But my point to you is, the world of our friends and family with autism makes perfect sense to those folks. Our job as their community is to honor that, to ask questions, and to really listen, often between the lines and between the years in my case, for the information that we need to make the kind of support that the Stern Center exists to do, that some of you in this room do with your friends and family, that I do as a mom, to make that kind of support possible and to create the kinds of inclusive communities that this terrific grant is reaching for. And I said earlier that the Stern Center has learning in its name, right? That's the point of it, learning. We stumble, we decode, sometimes we never get the decoder answer. And there's an enormous amount of patience and personal growth and humility that comes with that process for us as parents, as educators, and as community members. And so that's one of the reasons I think that a truly neurodiverse and welcoming environment is such a powerful thing, because it rearranges all of our perspectives. I will say just in closing about this advice question that self-care, I wrote this down and then forgot to say it, in order to go the distance supporting someone with autism, regardless of how their autism manifests, there are two things that are absolutely critical. One is taking care of oneself, which is incredibly hard, by the way, when you have a person with these needs in your life, and finding your understanding community. Gotta have people to talk to, gotta have time to take care of yourself. Simplest advice in the world, hardest to follow.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you both. Okay, so next we'll do our last turn and talk. We're going to combine the two questions that we just addressed. And so what can we do as individuals and collectively to positively impact the reading/literacy and overall learning outcomes of our children? And then I would like you to think about what type of action steps we as individuals and collectively can take to help improve the learning outcomes, the literacy, reading, the accessibility for our children. Okay. So that is what we'll talk about. And again, let's see, we're on the third one is specifically about dyslexia, and the fourth one is about autism. Thank you so much. Okay, and that will be our last turn and talk. And then we're going to do a final reflection quickly. Thank you. All right. So again, what can we... Thank you. I think our conversations have been really deep and meaningful today, and I thank you all. Peggy They have, you have your business cards here, you said?
Yes.
So please take information, which they have out on the table here, and their cards, and also I wanted, and they do have resources that they've shared with me, and I put them on a digital tool, which I will then attach, or someone here will attach to the website, to our Manchester Community Library website. So there are decodable books on there and other resources that are of super value. Another thing I'd like to mention is today we have Karen Grafflin and Jonathan Clark from the Vermont Department of Libraries here. And Karen is in charge of the ABLE Library. And the ABLE Library, you can request resources through any public library or school library in the state. And they have wonder books, and they have, recently Karen just told me, she purchased decodable books. So if we don't have them, you can get them through Karen, through the ABLE Library. So please, please, please take information that she brought, which is right where Carrie is standing. So we have lots of information for you. Please, please take it before you leave today. And we want to thank you all for being here. If you could, I still need some comments. We kind of ran out of time. Just some comments, interesting ideas you have about action steps that we can take to ensure learning, literacy, reading, learning outcomes improve in our state. Any ideas you have, let us know. So if you could please fill those out for question number 3 and 4, again, dyslexia and autism. And then in the back, I have a reflection. There are 3 items on that. And if you all could fill out any remaining questions you have, what you learned today, is there something that, was like an aha moment? What did you learn today? And what idea or action items are you excited about? So, so I know you were just discussing those, so if you could, again, put those down and then answer those 3 questions back there, it would be wonderful. And thank you again for coming. Did you want to have any closing remarks?
Just thank you so much for having us, and I know that Stephanie, our colleague, has prepared some one-pagers, fact sheets about dyslexia and autism that might be useful to you. Feel free to grab a couple, share them with friends.
I just wanted to add that I feel so much hope and excitement and energy from the educators and the families that I get to work with. And if you want to visit a school that's really doing this in action and teaching handwriting in cursive, check out Virgin's Union Elementary School. They have a long-term partnership working with the Stern Center, and thanks to some funding, the Stern Center tries to do some funding to make it more affordable for schools. So I really feel like I'm such a proud Vermonter. We can do this here in Vermont and be the leader for the rest of this country, because all our kids deserve this.
Okay.
One final question. We are 2 and 4 hours from you guys.
Yeah.
Virgin's is really easy to get to. How do you do stuff, virtually? Is that how you're reaching the more rural parts of the state?
I could talk about, since I guess a slim silver lining of this terrible pandemic that we've all just been through is that our Orton Gillingham and for the most part, most of our professional learning has gone online. And a lot of the coaching and consulting that we do through video conferencing too. So like that example of that 5th grader, I observed him that lesson via Zoom, and then I met with the teacher, and it was all remote. And I don't know if you want to talk about some of the other services or...
Well, just to add that we're now about 50-50 in our instruction program. Social learning and communication, for some obvious reasons, is a little bit more powerful face-to-face, right? But academic instruction in reading, in math, These areas have now become fully hybrid at the Stern Center, and as Peggy said, almost all of our work with teachers in schools is fully virtual. For exactly the reason you cite, not only here in Vermont, but across the U.S., we want teachers to have access to this, and we have really thoughtful teachers of teachers who recognize that some of us are a little burned out on learning via online, and that creating community in really deliberate and thoughtful ways, as Peggy does in her courses, as our colleagues do, is possible. You know, we're not just broadcasting facelessly. We are creating community and creating real learning for teachers in those spaces.
Okay.
So if I could, I just want to reiterate, thank you to everyone for coming out today. I got to listen and participate just a little bit as I was going around doing images. Amazing conversations, and hopefully that will continue. You're all welcome to hang out. We've got a lot going on here at the library today. There's some really good food if this has stimulated your appetite. Music outside, and of course there will be a bunch of us around to continue to talk about some of the subjects we had today. So again, thank you everyone for coming out today.
And please write down some action items, and thank you, Gina, for being here. We really appreciate it.